He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. In a few days' time, it's World Press Freedom Day, and we'll get a fresh set of stats from Reporters Without Borders on the number of media workers hurt, harmed, killed and detained all around the world. And with what's been happening in the world this past year, it could be a record number. We'll hear about that from one former reporter who definitely doesn't take his freedom for granted anymore. Now, here in New Zealand, we'll probably be comfortably in the top 20 for media freedom next week. No bad thing, but we used to be better. And when it comes to getting at the truth about state services, well, the facts are not always freely available when the law says they should be.
As long as we can maintain our status and call out things which are wrong, the public can have confidence that there's a watchdog always looking and always calling things out if needs be.
The words of outgoing Chief Ombudsman Peter Bosher there on last Sunday's edition of RNZ's weekly programme about Parliament, the House. Now, the Ombudsman is an officer of Parliament and responsible for the monitoring of government and its agencies. But crucially, the office of the Ombudsman is politically independent from all of them and able to call them to account. And he has a staff of more than 250 to help with that. Now, the handling of complaints about requests made under the Official Information Act, or OIAs as the media call them, is a big part of that role, and it's probably the one our media care about the most. And when he recently wrapped up 9 years in the job, the Chief Ombudsman told the House the Act hasn't always been respected as it should.
I'm disappointed in some agencies, such as Corrections and such as Health New Zealand, that have regressed or failed to embrace change.
So not angry then, but definitely disappointed. In his final report to Parliament, the Chief Ombudsman also said that journalists have become utterly frustrated with delays. And on his way out of the job, he told the subscription news service Politic about an astounding increase of 76% in complaints about Health New Zealand over the past year. And
I finally said to Health New Zealand, I'm going to have to criticise you publicly. In fact, if you don't improve, I'll even go further than that, just to show that we're unwilling to sit back and let them break the law.
And Sir Peter was about to call in the Solicitor General over possible prosecutions, he told Politic. And on TVNZ's Q&A show recently was even more blunt.
Health New Zealand is a disgrace.
Why?
Because people want to know about health issues. It's the one thing that New Zealanders need to know about and have got the right to know about. Trying to get official information out of Health New Zealand has been a nightmare. Two things: breaches of the law, which I really can't just look the other way. I've got to talk about. It's not acceptable. And other times when there is a recommendation to release and they say they will, on occasions they haven't. I just find that really discourteous.
Well, discourteousness is one word for it. On TVNZ's Q&A, the outgoing Ombudsman even suggested that highly paid public sector CEOs could be hit with financial penalties personally for non-compliance, and that might just encourage more courteousness in the long run. But one problem with that these days in health is almost the entire top level of leadership has quit in recent weeks, at the Ministry, at Health New Zealand Te Whatu Ora and at Pharmac, while Dr Diana Sarfati finished up as Director General of Health in mid-February, 2 years earlier than expected. The challenge of restructuring and unifying an entire health system is not to be underestimated, she said on her way out. And that's also a message we're getting these days in media reports featuring distressed doctors on the front line almost daily.
To other news, the former head of Nelson Hospital's cardiology unit says some patients' heart diseases have become inoperable because of delays. The doctor is the latest practitioner to raise concerns with One News about the region's failing health system.
I've had knowledge of patients who've had care delayed because the GP hasn't received their heart ultrasound scan. I've also had patients who've now got inoperable heart disease because we couldn't provide them with a heart scan 12 months ago.
TVNZ's One News last weekend, and as the presenter Wendy Petrie said there, Tammy Pegg was far from the first senior doctor in Nelson to speak out. And it's not just happening in Nelson.
A Northland emergency doctor says the health system is in a death spiral with woeful understaffing, budget constraints and leaky buildings with no money to fix them. The Whangarei Hospital rebuild is officially in red, meaning government officials have labelled it a project at significant risk due to insufficient funds.
That Northland doctor, Gary Painda, spoke out on RNZ's Checkpoint last month after lifting the lid at length on problems in the north in his Substack blog. But while discontent is pretty easy to report if medical professionals go public about it, getting the information from outside the health sector has not been easy for journalists, and they say that's because of the way information is often managed. For example, the same week the Ombudsman finished up, RNZ's Anusha Bradley reported that Starship Hospital's sole specialist in paediatric palliative care would soon be on leave, and that would leave sick kids short of proper care. Health NZ told RNZ there was money for additional specialist and nursing roles and that recruitment was underway. But when pressed on that, it declined to provide details. A job listing seeking a general paediatrician with an interest in palliative care was only posted on Health NZ's website after RNZ published its story. But when asked why a specialist paediatrician was not specifically sought from the start, Health New Zealand just didn't respond. But RNZ's Anusha Bradley then reported the job ad had been amended to specify an experienced paediatric palliative care specialist. In response to all that, the Health Minister Simeon Brown told RNZ this.
Firstly, they should be providing accurate responses to media queries, and secondly, they should be, they've said they're advertising for these roles, they should be advertising accurately for them.
Well, good for media to know that now. Another reporter who's come up against the reluctance to release health information was Rachel Thomas of Wellington's daily paper The Post. In one of her last pieces for the paper, she said that Health NZ had confirmed that by the end of last year, 46 New Zealanders had waited more than 3 years for treatment, and more than 2,500 people have waited at least 1 year, she reported, but it took her much more than that just to find that out from Health New Zealand.
The Post has spent the past 19 months trying to get information on how many people have waited 3 years for surgery. It was only released after a complaint to the Ombudsman.
And Mediawatch has seen that time-consuming series of communications over that period. Peter Bosch's response to all that was this.
It's difficult to understand how Health NZ proposes to work towards the government's targets and meet its reporting expectations if data on surgical and treatment waitlists cannot be compiled.
Sir Peter in the end instructed Health NZ to apologise and explain what steps are being taken to ensure that accurate information about waitlists can be made available to the public and to review the refusal of OIA requests when citing that problem of substantial collation. And then Rachel Thomas's recent article all about this, published in the Post, included photos of surgeons at a conference who were being shown slides of that very data on big screens, and that was back in mid-2023. Now, like the Chief Ombudsman, Peter Boscher, Rachel Thomas has stepped down from her job recently as the Post's health reporter, and she also published her final thoughts as she went, and she's now on the other side of the fence, so to speak, with the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists, the union for senior doctors. Well, Rachel, just speaking as a news consumer, it just feels at the moment like almost every single day, literally, there is a new and alarming story about problems, about failures and shortages in health. Is it that there's a huge uptick at the moment, or has it kind of always been like this? We're just noticing it more?
I think before there's been pockets of problems. So, we'd see a nursing crisis, we'd see stories about postcode lotteries or the mental health workforce crisis that everyone will remember from a few years back. But in the past year, certainly we've had this takeover from the Commissioner, which has kind of put this veil of chaos over everything. There's a hiring freeze that's not a hiring freeze. Services are at breaking point and are now unable to get assistance because of these hiring processes. Support and those non-clinical staff is facing cutbacks. On top of that, you've got no board and very little information flowing through. So no one knows where to turn anymore. So you've got patients, clinicians, all of these health staff unable to kind of find resolutions on things, so then they go to the media. Even
when we do have what you might call good news, this is something you pointed out in your recent article, it sometimes doesn't seem to bring good headlines. For example, Pharmac, so much pressure, the budget has been boosted, the government is committed to it, but that still doesn't seem to be a source of good headlines. How come?
Well, I would push back on you a little bit there, Colin. I mean, there were some positive headlines about that announcement and stories from the people who were benefiting. I mean, even last December, we were interviewing people who were going to be around for Christmas with their families because they had an extension of life thanks to those drugs. But there's always a but, and those people had already drained their KiwiSaver when those drugs weren't funded. There's still so many New Zealanders who don't have the medicines they need and don't have access to the care they need, and that's where the media focus is always going to be. And I guess if you think about that particular policy, the government was looking at 13 drugs and telling Pharmac what to buy, and so it was so chaotic. I think we needed to acknowledge that.
In your article, you mentioned that some people don't have to drain their KiwiSaver to get cancer drugs. For example, this is quoting from your piece, if you contract sepsis after a complicated surgery, speaking from experience, you say, you will get world-class care. If you break your neck, ACC pays your mortgage, your care is the envy of every American. Do we forget this stuff in this rash of stories about a health system in crisis?
I wrote that because I think it's important to acknowledge there are parts of our health system working as they should. If you or I walk out of here and get hit by a bus, we're going to get great care in Wellington Hospital because it's a great big tertiary hospital. We'll be seen straight away and we'll probably get our surgeries today. However, if you were hit by that same bus in Kaitaia, I'm not sure if Kaitaia has buses, but, hypothetically, you might face a very different set of circumstances. Positive things don't necessarily make headlines a lot of the time because there's not a lot of news value in something that's designed to work in a particular way, working as it should.
But in order to report accurately on things as they are and where the problems really exist, you need data, facts, information. Coincidental, I guess, that you left your reporting job roughly about the same time as the Chief Ombudsman, but both singling out Health New Zealand as a real difficulty in getting information. But what in your view explains that reluctance, that sort of foot dragging in releasing official information?
So that story about the waiting list, waited 625 days for data on patients waiting 3 years for treatment. That's information I knew they had because I'd seen a version of it presented at a conference where I was in the room. I mean, they ended up arguing that data would have taken considerable time to pull together and would have been through a validation process. Okay, great. So then release the presentation to me and save us all 600 days of going through the Ombudsman. I mean, at a basic level, it feels like Te Whatu Ora just doesn't really know what it's doing when it comes to the Act. Timeframes, refusals, the right to access things. In a recent example, I OIA'd some correspondence between leaders at Health New Zealand and was told to narrow the scope, and I worked with someone in the OIA team to do that. Then the OIA came back that there was nothing in the scope of the request, so it was declined. And so, off we go to the Ombudsman going, well, this feels obstructive. They argued it wasn't, but I can't see that, that's not how the Act is supposed to work. I really think it just comes down to a lack of understanding of the legal obligations under this legislation that exists to enable us to have free access to information.
Do you think it is an effort to hide or suppress or maybe minimise bad news? And if so, is that possibly understandable? Because, there are so many difficult stories about the health system that are affecting public opinion.
I think transparency is so important with an agency that spends $28 billion of taxpayers' money and is designed to keep us alive and keep us healthy. That transparency largely disappeared under district health boards. So information that used to be regularly released, and we used to get agendas for board meetings that were 200 pages long, and this was just for your local Capital and Coast District Health Board that would have crucial data in it that we now have to OIA because there is no board. Those meetings don't exist, and when they did exist, we would get a 2-page agenda and we'd be locked out after the first half an hour. We can't pick up the phone and call board members. It comes down to having to cultivate good sources because, I think that the best recommendation I can have for people that are wanting to confront these tactics is fight them. I mean, go to the Ombudsman, write about media, have the ability to write about these issues and pressure them to front up.
So, other than just being persistent, is there another kind of way around this? Can the media maybe pool their efforts to get information, or do we need something like the open justice system for reporting on the courts? Maybe we need some sort of pan-media initiative like that?
I mean, health reporters often do work across the divide and talk to each other about what they're doing. There is a lot of merit in focusing sort of projects on particular things. I mean, I did one on cancer drugs last year in March, as the government was debating how to roll out the cancer drugs promise. That led to changes that we saw in the final policy. But it is really, really difficult, and you have to have a lot of patience. I mean, last year, 2023, Health NZ randomly decided it would stop accepting privacy waivers about patients. A few of us at Stuff at the time, myself, Simon Plum and Hannah Martin, decided we would fight them on it. And they dragged us through committee after committee, legal rationalisation teams.
So to be clear, that's where a patient has said, I'm happy for you, the media, to inquire on my behalf about my situation and report on it.
Exactly. So we, for a long time under district health boards, and even initially when it switched to Te Whatu order, we would send privacy waivers about particular patient stories. Something's gone wrong, patient wants us to try to find out, and Health NZ would take a couple of days and come back to us. That just one day we got the response, sorry, considering our obligations under the Privacy Act, we cannot comment on this case. It actually disadvantaged them, I think, more than anything, because it meant we would still run these stories, but Health NZ was refusing to comment. So we were stuck in this situation where it was kind of concentrated to the patient's experience, which doesn't really benefit anyone if Health NZ just says, we're not going to comment. It went through various committees and ultimately resulted in a 2-page privacy waiver, which Health NZ came up with and now uses. But just this week I emailed them and I got an auto reply from the media team saying, if you've sent us a privacy waiver, these things will be considered by legal teams, clinical teams, and you should expect to wait 7 days for a response. In what world can media wait 7 days? I mean, that's just absurd.
Well, okay, so frustrating for media, clearly. But we know Health NZ, Oranga Tamariki and other agencies, they've had huge stories about privacy breaches, really damaging stories. Isn't it natural that they would be, at the very least, cautious?
But there's caution and then there's obstruction. And privacy breaches are usually the result of something like hacking or bad actors. When it comes to patient information and we're producing privacy waivers that allow the patient to knowingly waive their privacy rights, then Health New Zealand is always given the opportunity to check that and make sure the patient wasn't put under duress or anything.
Peter Boscher, when he left, he did say there's been a huge increase in complaints, I think specifically about Health New Zealand that they were dealing with, but also more generally, lots more requests, some of them kind of vexatious. Doesn't that partly explain why things will take longer? And should we not cut agencies of state some slack if they are dealing with an awful lot of requests for information?
No, I don't think so. The Official Information Act has always existed to make information freely available, so it doesn't really matter what the motivation is. Again, this is a $28 billion agency.
Not all information, though, where it should be freely available, yes, but they still have to apply tests to it, which would take time.
Of course. A lot of this information is information that would have been available previously under the district health boards and now isn't. And I've said to them, I know you're under pressure, but I struggle to have sympathy for this when the transparency just isn't here as it used to be.
Well, as you pointed out in your outgoing article, if I can call it that, a whole layer of top health sector leadership has just quit lately. Do you think the pressure of media exposure and that might have something to do with that, all the bad stories? Could it even conceivably make the recruitment of people harder, the people that we really need to lead and restore the sector? If they're reading all these bad stories, that can't make it any easier?
Yes, the media focus will have had something to do with that. I mean, certainly I pointed out there was a period of time at the beginning of the year where I would publish a story about a leader not having faith in a particular agency leader. It was either a minister or, in some cases, Lester Levy not having faith in the person that was there to lead their organisation. And then a week or two later, they would resign. I'm not saying that was my doing entirely. Right. I think there's been a lot of discomfort and discontent brewing among a lot of those sector leaders for a long time. But I guess the media is always there to hold the mirror up. If we're writing a story where the health minister refuses to have confidence in a leader, that's a key problem that Health NZ has, whether it's a leader, a doctor, a nurse, non-clinical person. They just feel like they are so undervalued.
Yeah, you did even say in your piece, perhaps the scandals uncovered by Stuff's Paula Penfold of undisclosed skeletons in executive leaders' closets, that's over the past 4 weeks or so, might have slowed things up in recruitment terms. Could have that effect, couldn't it?
It could. I mean, they're also going through, they say there's a global search going on. Clearly, I mean, we need to do background checks on people because this has happened again and again where the wrong people have been in the wrong places.
And now you've gone, you've left health reporting, but you're still in the sector. You're working for the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists. Effectively, that puts you, I guess, on the side, I guess, of the senior doctors. Do you kind of have now an interest in making sure that problems with the health sector are discussed, are aired, and particularly the grievances of doctors about shortages and stuff. And you're working for the union.
I mean, of course, a union has a very clear agenda to protect its members, that these members are senior doctors and dentists, so the interest of these members by design is to protect patients. Yes, there is a bias there, and people are free to accuse me of that now.
Your email has a little banner on the bottom about the current strike action, Mayday, Mayday, health system in crisis. So, that's a message you're getting out.
Well, absolutely. I mean, but again, it comes back to the same place of holding a mirror up to the problems in the system and putting pressure on decision makers to address them. But I guess outside of all of this, outside of my professional career, I have spent most of my life in the health system as a person with very severe Crohn's disease. When I mentioned that getting sepsis and getting excellent care, that was after a surgery that I was very lucky to survive. That makes you very passionate about other people receiving that same level of care. I haven't always received great care. I guess without our health system, without our public health system, I certainly wouldn't be alive, trying to ensure that people can get healthcare when they need it, no matter what. That's what's underpinned my reporting. That's what has motivated this career move.
From your new perspective, what would you change, you think, about the way our media cover health?
Having dedicated health reporters in key newsrooms makes a huge difference, and giving those reporters the time to cultivate their contacts, to dig through documents, to make OIA requests. I was lucky enough at the Post that I was given the time to do that. I had a senior clinician say to me, you are the person I read when I'm trying to get information about my employer. That's what it's become. And I guess only with us continuing to hold that mirror up will things change.
And the fact that things like the Ipsos Issues Monitor now have health right at the top. So when it goes in cycles, I know, but the fact that's right at the top, you'd say that will give you heart that editors would look at that and say that's clearly something the public wants more information about.
Absolutely. I mean, health is going to be the decider of the next election, isn't it?
Do you think?
I think so. Perhaps I'm in a bubble, but where are we if we don't have a good health system?
That was Rachel Thomas, until recently the health reporter at Wellington's daily paper The Post, and now she's a writer and communications advisor for the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists, the Union for Senior Doctors. New Zealand First certainly knows how to get a headline or two by drafting controversial legislation and then letting the media know. On Tuesday, a statement declared that the party had introduced a members' bill that would ensure the biological definition of a woman and a man are defined in law. But oh no, it hasn't, said veteran political correspondent Richard Harman, pointing out that can only happen if the bill is selected in the good old biscuit tin ballot in the fullness of time. Words matter, said Richard Harman, turning the very words the party leader Winston Peters had used when promoting his putative legislation back against him. Now, Winston Peters had plenty more to say in an interview all about that on Morning Report on Wednesday, one that he tried to conduct himself at the start.
Good morning. Can I ask you a question?
Well, I asked the questions. It'll have to be a relevant one.
And after that, it all went downhill, or maybe uphill from Winston Peters' point of view, when the Deputy Prime Minister made a threat to turn off the taxpayers' tap for RNZ.
The fact is you're paid for by a taxpayer, and sooner or later we're going to cut that water off too, because you're an abuse on the taxpayer. You're not hearing both sides of the story. You keep on putting the argument of the woke left. You're a disgrace to the mainstream media.
And there was plenty more where that came from on social media, where presenter Corin Dan was insulted as a woke, arrogant loser, and more by Winston Peters on Elon Musk's platform X. But was Winston Peters holding a sword of Damocles over the financial lifeblood of Corin Dan's employer RNZ, or was he writing a cheque his on-air mouth couldn't cash, or cancel, or whatever the appropriate metaphor really is? Well, it was the latter, according to his soon-to-be successor as Deputy PM in the coalition government, David Seymour. He told reporters this on Wednesday at a stand-up media conference held, coincidentally, but maybe appropriately, at a preschool.
The government, of course, has a budget coming up and has to make decisions about all funding line items. RNZ is one of those, but it's actually under the portfolio of arts, culture and heritage. So the person to announce anything like that, if there was anything like that, would actually be Paul Goldsmith. And the actual Minister of Media and Broadcasting has had nothing to say about all this so far.
But it isn't the first time that Winston Peters has blurted out vague but ultimately impotent threats to public funding of media outlets during interviews on those outlets, which he didn't seem to like. Hayden Donnell took a look at that last Wednesday on Midweek Mediawatch, our weekly catch-up with Knights here on RNZ National, where they also talked about an awkward on-the-record moment for a mayoral candidate in Wellington.
What do you make of that comment?
She's full of shit.
She's full of shit.
Yeah.
And they also talked about an extraordinary eyewitness account in Australia.
And one guy, he was up there with our mum, and he went up there and he was coming back down towards us, and he goes, "Run, he's got a gun."
And as well as all that, they talked, of course, about the big breaking news event of the week, the death of Pope Francis. So hear how that was handled by the media on Midweek Mediawatch with Hayden Donnell this week. If you missed it, it's on the Mediawatch podcast page at rnz.co.nz, or you'll find it on our feed for free at Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Last weekend here on Mediawatch, we heard from former foreign correspondent Peter Grester, an Australian reporter who was once a regular contributor here on RNZ National when he was working for the BBC in Africa. And later, he became a media freedom cause celebrant globally when he was jailed in Egypt for more than a year. He and two Egyptian Al Jazeera colleagues were convicted on trumped-up charges of aiding and abetting terrorism back in 2013. And as we heard last week here on Mediawatch, the worst moments of his life have now been turned into a movie, The Correspondent. Peter Grester also wrote about the experience himself in a book called The First Casualty, which has now been updated and retitled as The Correspondent. After his release from jail in 2015, Peter Grester founded the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. And this coming week, it's World Press Freedom Day, a day when countries like ours are urged not to take media freedom for granted. There will also be fresh figures for journalists elsewhere hurt, killed and jailed these past 12 months, and going by what's happened in and around Gaza, a new record number seems likely. Now, another reason that Peter Grester has updated his book is that it wasn't the first from an Australian with that same title, The First Casualty. The late Philip Knightley published a history of journalism with that title back in 2004. Now, back then, Philip Knightley argued that the days of the foreign correspondent as we knew it were over, so I asked Peter Grester, was his predecessor wrong or ahead of his time?
I think the answer to both questions is yes, bizarrely. The time of correspondence, at least as we understood them, is now over. Technology, social media, the digital revolution have all radically changed the nature of the work that we used to do. There are always going to be people who are interested in doing this kind of work in whatever form it might take. It's just that at the moment, I think we're in a period of transition where we don't really understand what that looks like and how that should actually work. The problem is we desperately need to hear from local correspondents. No one understands, no one is able to cover what's happening in Gaza quite the same as the local Palestinian journalists are. But the problem is that they are always going to be seen as partisan, regardless of how genuinely independent or accurately they may be reporting. And so we need outsiders, we need foreign correspondents to have those genuinely independent eyes and ears in places like Gaza, and who are also capable of interpreting and narrating those stories for their own domestic audiences, because, again, people will need to see and hear those stories in the context of their own cultures, their own political environments.
After The First Casualty, when we spoke, you wwere telling me, I mean, it's in the book as well, that you believed journalists themselves were increasingly becoming the victim of politics all around the world. Maybe that's kind of obvious, they always have been, and that's not especially profound in and of itself. But, I mean, in the 7 years since then, like, even more so, right?
No, I think, but not just the targets of politics. They've literally had targets on their backs. And I think the story that I saw starting in 2001, after 9/11, I think is continuing today. When George W. Bush launched what he called the War on Terror, that gave governments everywhere the license to use the rhetoric of national security and terrorism to come after uncomfortable journalism. It created a war of ideas, and the space where ideas are transmitted becomes a part of the battlefield. I thought that those ideas would date, that the narrative around the war on terror would grow old, that we'd move on and journalism would recover its place. But in fact, what we've seen is that the number of journalists in prison now are at record highs. The number of journalists who've been murdered for their work are also at record numbers. The Committee for the Protection of Journalists, based in New York, says that 2/3 of those journalists who are in prison are there on what they loosely call anti-state charges: treason, sedition, threats to national security, and, of course, terrorism. Well, that seems to confirm that governments are interpreting difficult journalism as an attack on national security, and I think that is deeply troubling. And we only need to look at what's happening in the United States, where Donald Trump has decided to ban Associated Press from press briefings. We've seen threats of legal action against news organisations that are critically reporting his administration. If that's happening in the United States, then it can pretty much happen anywhere.
I mean, you mentioned there record numbers of journalists jailed or detained, also killed. I mean, partly that's because there's a spike because of what is going on in Gaza, Palestine, elsewhere, even neighbouring territories. Some evidence, some suspicion about them being targeted.
I think calling it a suspicion is being a little bit generous. There is plenty of evidence.
Well, in some cases it's suspected, in other cases there's fairly strong evidence that at the very least they knew that in launching certain attacks that it was very likely that journalists and media workers would be killed or harmed.
Yeah, and most of those have been justified on security grounds. The Israelis in particular have always said that they've been targeting terrorists, sympathisers of terrorist operatives, even though there is no evidence to support that in a lot of cases. In most of those cases, it is weaponising the rhetoric around terrorism and national security to target journalists. And what's happening in Gaza is the most egregious example, but we've also seen it in places like Russia and China and Ukraine and elsewhere.
One of your first big jobs as a correspondent was in Kabul, Afghanistan, I think 1995, before the Taliban swept in, but after the Taliban came in the second time, you at that point were very concerned about media workers, media organisations that had been encouraged to flourish in the interregnum between the two Taliban reigns, if we could put it like that. And you were really worried in 2021 what was going to happen when other countries bailed out so suddenly. Do we really know how that panned out and what things are like under this new regime?
Oh, it's pretty shocking. People have moved on. Attentions have shifted to places like Gaza and Ukraine, but the record for journalists is still very, very grim indeed. And I still often get emails from Afghan journalists who are trying to stay alive, that are trying to get out of the country. There's a limit to what we can do, but the crisis for journalism, I think, in Afghanistan remains just as serious as it ever was.
I mean, to the best of your knowledge, are there any outlets able to carry on independent type reporting under the conditions of Taliban rule?
There are people who can report, and I think the answer to that is no. Journalists are always going to be reporting, fully aware that if they get too critical, if they cover certain issues, then we'll become targets, and that makes it incredibly difficult to do the kind of journalism that is genuinely independent and authoritative and accurate.
Would there be broadcasting that goes on that isn't controlled by or influenced by government or going out that the government there is prepared to let go, or do they have control of it all?
Not necessarily direct, explicit control, but you use the word influence, and I think that's the key. You don't always have to have direct threats, but it is enough for journalists operating there to see what's been happening to any of their colleagues who are reporting things that challenge the government, that question them, that perhaps suggest that there might be corruption going on, or that they're treating women unfairly, or that there may be other abuses that need to be exposed. It's very, very difficult to do that kind of reporting without risking your own life. And so obviously that is going to influence the way that people cover it.
That was Peter Grester, former foreign correspondent who was jailed in Egypt a decade ago along with two colleagues just for doing his job of journalism. And a new film all about that, The Correspondent, is in cinemas now, and Peter's book of the same name about all that and the bigger picture of media freedom today will be published shortly. And next week, May the 3rd, it's World Press Freedom Day. Let's see how New Zealand fares in the World Press Freedom rankings from Reporters Without Borders. That's it for this weekend. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week. If you have any thoughts to share with us or ideas for us to follow up, or if you spot anything you think we should know about, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X. And you can even write us a letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. I'll be back next Wednesday with Midweek Mediawatch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Mediawatch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.